Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are advised that this program contains images and voices of people who have died.
Miriam Corowa. Welcome to Aboriginal country on the south coast of Sydney. My name's Auntie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor, and I'm Aboriginal, Gadigal, Darug and Yuin elder, traditional descendant of those areas. But today we're on Aboriginal country, and the language that we speak is Dharawal. So not far from here, at Botany Bay, Captain Cook landed, and with his crew, and when he came, the Aboriginal people on the shore put up their spears and were warning them, "Warra warra weir, don't come here, stay away." So 250 years ago, the English people came and took over our land. We are the traditional descendants, the custodians of this area. And this is an area that's very important to us. There's been ceremonies conducted here on this beautiful beach, and so we just wanted to come here and welcome everyone on our country, on land, and at this beautiful beach. First Nations people and everyone coming together, I think it's wonderful, and it's the only way that we're going to be able to go forward and move forward as a country. We still have a connection here, and it's part of our culture to keep that connection. Around this area, we get our shells and we do our shell work, and we also collect our foods and our medicines and our ceremonial objects that we need to do our ceremonies. So it's a very important area. We've been here for over 80,000 years, and we're still here. We're still doing our fishing during the mullet season and so on. We're very honoured to be here on our country, and to be able to let you know a bit about our country, and that we're still here and we're still doing our ceremonies. And it's very important that our culture and our knowledge is passed down to the younger people to keep our culture strong and alive. Thank you.
Auntie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor, Gadigal, Bidjigal, Darug and Yuin elder there, with a welcome to country for our special January 26 program, exploring First Nations perspectives on a day that holds deep emotional and historical significance. We begin our broadcast on Gadigal country. I pay my respects to their elders and the custodians of this land. I'm Miriam Corowa, a Bundjalung woman of northern New South Wales. I'm very emotional. It is my great honour to have you join us for the next hour. We'll be hearing from reporters at community events. We'll bring you a feature-length documentary exploring the history of the Tent Embassy, which is marking 50 years today in Canberra. And we will have a discussion with leading Indigenous activists, Pat Anderson and Luke Pearson, on what this day means, and speak to Wesley Enoch, Creative Director of a campfire gathering event in the National Capital.
While many mark January 26 as Australia Day, many others mark it as a day of mourning, one of survival and of invasion. And that's exactly what's happened here today at Sydney's Invasion Day March. It began at Sydney's Town Hall, where a number of speeches were heard about Aboriginal deaths in custody and the ongoing land rights struggle. But today is also a time to reflect and remember those that have fought for Indigenous rights in the decades gone by. The march stopped at Australia Hall, which is a significant site. It's where the 1938 Day of Mourning took place all those decades ago. Of course, there are a number of COVID precautions in place. Attendees have been asked to wear a mask and to maintain social distancing, and if they are feeling unwell, to stay home. Now, the march has made its way down to the Yarman Festival, which is celebrating its 20 years this year. Of course, there are a number of COVID precautions in place for that event as well, but the main event will be across the street in the Seymour Centre, where 500 people will be seated to listen to a number of live acts. And while many of its events have gone online this year, there will also be some market stalls, speeches and live music for people to enjoy.
Nakari Thorpe there on Gadigal country covering the events taking place there today. Among them, there were thousands who marched along George Street in Sydney's city centre. Well, further north in the New South Wales Hunter region, Bindi Bryce has been following how the community in Newcastle has come together.
I'm here on the lands of the Worimi and Awabakal people, and we've had a real treat here at Nobby's Beach. We've seen music legend John Paul Young performing. We've also had a celebrity rugby game, and greats like Lottie Takiri, Owen Craigie and Willie Mason have been showing off their skills on the sand. And this came after a massive protest march was held in Newcastle this morning. Members of the community wanted to turn out to hear from local Aboriginal leaders and hear their reflections on the memories of trauma and dispossession that Aboriginal people are reminded of on this day.
I suppose some days we get emotional about it. It's a long time coming, and with the reconciliation approach that was used today, you're getting the message across that we could all unite as one, is one big key message to come out of it. And we have to heal our own trauma and move forward for the betterment of all, I think.
It's been a great day here at Nobby's, and amid ongoing debates and discussions about Australia Day, the community here in Newcastle has really put its own stamp on January 26.
Let's now go to Ngambri Ngunnawal country in Canberra, where there's been a national focus on events. Dan Borsha has been involved with hosting the capital's citizenship ceremony, and we caught up with him to find out how it all went.
G'day, Miriam. Well, it's good to be joining you here from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, where it has been a very busy 24 hours. Of course, starting with the Australian of the Year Awards last night, where we really saw a focus around equity and about visibility for groups in our society who have been left out, forgotten, perhaps even ignored, right through to the national citizenship and flag raising ceremony here on the shore of Lake Burley Griffin. And Miriam, the wonderful thing about this ceremony is that there were 19 new Australians conferred with citizenship today from 9 countries. They have incredible stories. There was the couple who met the first day they were in Australia, married a year later, become citizens today. Their baby was with them. All of this was done with the blessing of Aunty Violet Sheridan, Ngunnawal elder, who not only gave a really powerful welcome to country at the beginning of the service, but then also gave each of the conferees a very special leaf from a gum tree that had been through a smoking ceremony, of course, to make sure that their pathway into citizenship was clear. Then across the lake from me is where everything is happening at the Tent Embassy today, marking a very special occasion. Its 50th anniversary, Miriam.
As Dan mentioned, the Tent Embassy in the lawns of Old Parliament House has been a focal point of the fight for land rights and First Nations recognition for 50 years. Ahead of the anniversary, Dan Borchet took an in-depth look at how it all began back in 1972. And a warning for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers. This story includes recordings of people who've died.
Unauthorised camping constitutes a breach of Commonwealth law.
History is repeating. A chant echoing through time. Scenes played out over and again on this site. In 1972, a small group of Aboriginal activists transformed an opportunistic accident into the world's longest-running protest, capturing global attention and bringing significant historical and political change in Australia.
Raising a flag saying that we're aliens in our own land and that we're a sovereign people.
We're going to get our bloody land, even if we have to take it.
It's a time to celebrate, but it's also a time to mourn and reflect on 50 years.
From its inception, the Tent Embassy has been interwoven with Canberra's physical and political landscape. Originally a humble beach umbrella, it's grown to become a symbol of Aboriginal land rights and sovereignty activism. The establishment of the embassy remains a pivotal moment in Australia's social history and an icon for First Nations people. The 60s and early 70s were a time for change in Australia. In 1963, the Australian government took 300 square kilometres of land from the Yolngu people in Arnhem Land so mining company Jaminco could extract bauxite.
The situation that's developed because of the wishes of the Yirrkala people has become complex. The cause remains simple: the bauxite.
In 1966, 200 Gurindji stockmen, domestic workers and their families walked off Wave Hill Station, beginning a 7-year strike fighting for equal pay conditions and land ownership.
These Aboriginal stockmen are on strike. This is the Wave Hill mob.
The strike highlighted some of the issues facing Aboriginal people. A year later, the successful 1967 referendum meant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would finally be counted as part of the population and provided more momentum to the land rights struggle by raising the profile of Indigenous issues with the wider Australian public.
We didn't see ourselves as Australian. We were, we were Murris, as we say back home. We were Aboriginal people, and they always reminded us of the fact that we were Aboriginal and the fact that there's a place for you Aborigines, and it's not in our white community and not in our clubs and pubs.
On the eve of Australia Day in 1972, the McMahon Liberal government announced its long-awaited policy on Indigenous affairs. It rejected independent ownership of the traditional land to Indigenous people in favour of 50-year general-purpose leases. It excluded all mineral and forest rights but allowed mining companies to access Aboriginal reserves.
That was pretty much, a bit of a hammer in the nail in the coffin for us to shut the lid on the past and say, OK, whatever it takes, here we come. We're coming after what is rightfully ours.
Indigenous groups were appalled at the government's continued refusal to acknowledge Aboriginal rights.
That's what land rights mean.
That means a lot of money, and that means a lot of people that are getting rich off your blood and guts.
In Sydney, 4 young men came together. They were to change Aboriginal Australia forever.
Michael Anderson, Billy Craigie, Joe Williams and Tony Curry, they headed to the nation's capital, but they didn't really have a protest plan.
When we got there, Canberra was raining, and you know, I always imagined that we put it up in the wintertime, but it was January because it was so cold. And we said, well, we're here to confront Billy McMahon and his government, and 4 of us, mind you. And we said, you know, OK, this is what we're going to do something. We haven't worked that out yet. So then they went through the idea of a hunger strike, and I recall my old mate Billy saying, yeah, well, we've been hungry all our lives, so no, I think we'll pass on that one. And we're going to get someone to feed us anyway while we're at the embassy. At the protest, and then someone said, oh, there was a guy in India. They have a popular way of protesting. They pour fuel on themselves and light them with a match and set fire to themselves. Well, that was out of the question, I can assure you of that. Everyone just looked at each other and sort of shook our heads without saying anything. And then someone else said, well, you know, what do? We go tribal, strip off and stand naked with spears and just wait for someone to come and talk to us. No, that's not on. So anyway, Tony Curry was on the throne down the hallway with the door open, and he was listening to the conversation, and then he called out, he said, this is the home of embassies here. So why don't we just call it the Aboriginal Embassy? And that we were sold on it immediately. And so we ended up with plaques. We made it manila folders, so we made up plaques and tore cardboard boxes and we put these signs up. And then the old man whose house we were at, he didn't have a tent. He said, I can't help you with the tent, boys, but he said, I can give you a beach umbrella. And we took that over, and that became the embassy. We ended up like, you know, an exhibit, I suppose, in a zoo, because I think every car in Canberra, when they realised on the ABC radio that there's 4 blackfellas sitting over there in front of Parliament House under a beach umbrella.
It stands to this day as a testament to the limitations of Australian laws and governments and the lack of action on Indigenous rights.
I know being younger, we have this fire in our belly and we're really passionate.
Leah House's grandmother Matilda joined the protest on the lawns of Old Parliament House.
It just makes me feel connected. It makes me feel like a part of me was there. And it's why I think I am so passionate today, because I know the history of my family and the connection that we have at that space.
We have come an incredibly long way, and I think we need to acknowledge the founders of the Tent Embassy for having their courage of conviction at a time when it would have been very hard knowing the consequences of setting up a place outside the Australian Parliament.
Those 4 young men, not all of them still with us, really sparked something in this country where the politicians, particularly the fact that it was out of the front of what is now Old Parliament House, had to actually take notice of what First Nations people were saying.
The setting up of an embassy and the intensive pressure for land rights comes from a new generation of Aboriginal spokesmen and leaders. On the whole, they're younger, more impatient and more militant than their predecessors.
Aboriginals think that the country still belongs to them, and all they want is for white man to recognise this fact and acknowledge it and you know, give them areas back which they decide they want back.
But this is one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, per head of population speaking. That to me, it's a scandal that there are so many Aboriginal kids dying from malnutrition, that there are so many blacks living in ghettos, in shanty towns, when in fact this is our land.
The embassy grew from one umbrella to a cluster of dozens of tents and attracted a diverse and articulate group of diplomatic staff, activists and supporters. But for the McMahon government, it was a huge embarrassment at home and around the world. Camping on Crown land was illegal, but considering most Crown land in the Northern Territory belonged to the state, Aboriginal people were exempt. Nobody ever thought that activists would camp in the nation's capital. They'd found a gap in the law.
As it turned out, there was not a law in Australia that could stop us from putting that embassy up.
I think the Tent Embassy has had the success it has had, what it had in the 70s, because back then it was such an original stunt, like what they did, what those men did and what all the mob did in those months after establishing the space had never been done before. And it was in a generation that kind of activism, yeah, it just hadn't been done, it was original. So I think that's why it has stood the test of time.
While the embassy enjoyed wide support, some politicians and members of the general public believed that the protest was nothing more than trespassing and was a blot on the Canberra landscape.
All I'm trying to basically say is that the time of white domination of the black movement is over. It's time for black people to do things for themselves and get things for themselves, because it's the only way they'll ever get anything, and we're getting it.
The fact that the Tent Embassy is still there 50 years on, making a very clear statement about the sovereign rights of First Nations people, making a very clear statement about the condition of Aboriginal Australia, is testament to just how important it was. And I think it's a symbol that has come to represent, to me personally, the struggle, the political struggle in particular, of Aboriginal Australia.
I thought, that won't last long. And then as time progressed, I remembered feeling this is one way to make governments listen by your presence. And over time, we've seen issues that have been covered in some of those debates, but in particular, when the McMahon government were not considering Aboriginal land rights, that's when the Tent Embassy came to the fore. But it's been really just a significant point of reference at which Indigenous people have been able to go there and have their issues promulgated through both media and to members of Parliament.
On the 6th of February, the embassy issued a list of demands: complete rights to the Northern Territory as a state within Australia and the installation of a primary Aboriginal state parliament. These rights would include all mining rights to the land, ownership and mining rights of all Australian reserve lands in Australia, the preservation of all sacred sites in Australia, ownership of areas in major cities including mining rights, compensation for lands that were not able to be returned starting with $6 billion and including a percentage of the gross national income every year.
I like to just think of myself and my three colleagues as the guys who woke Australia up and made the world aware of the fact that there was a problem here.
A visit by then opposition leader Gough Whitlam was seen as a great success in gaining recognition for their cause and having their ideas heard by those in power. On July 20th, during a parliamentary recess in the absence of Labor members, an amended trespass on Commonwealth lands in the ACT was passed, giving the Commonwealth powers to forcibly remove the embassy tents. Hours later, hundreds of Australian Federal Police moved in to dismantle the embassy tents.
The Tent Embassy had been on the lawns outside Federal Parliament for 6 months. It was there on Commonwealth land as a symbolic protest against the federal government's refusal to grant Aboriginal land rights. It didn't persuade the government to change its mind on that, but it did persuade them to pass an ordinance to stop the squatters. It was gazetted this morning, and the ACT police moved in shortly afterwards.
The police are only doing their duty, but it's a pretty dirty duty they've been given to do.
Hey, man, come on, get out.
bad for the police, but it's bad for the whole nation.
Who's won as a result of today?
I suppose Australia's lost, and the Aboriginal people at least will have everybody in Australia know what they're fighting about tonight.
It was a day in history that, for the first time, Aborigines really clashed with the authorities over fighting for our rights in land.
Later, the police returned in force.
That was pretty violent. It was. I've been in some brawls in pubs, and I've been in a few brawls on rugby league fields, all in brawls. Nothing like this. Nothing like that. And I must say that we met up with some of the policemen later who went to hospital because there were 18 of us went to jail, protesters. There were non-Aboriginal people as well in that. And they fought just as hard as we did.
Images of police violence against protesters spread across the country, leading to even greater support for the embassy and its aims. On July 30th, 1972, 2,000 people marched to Parliament House to reenact the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. The police removed the tents but let the demonstrators remain. The next month, the government convened the National Conference of Aboriginal and Islander Advisory Councillors.
We will legislate to give Aborigines land rights. Not just because their case is beyond argument, but because all of us as Australians are diminished, while the Aborigines are denied their rightful place in this nation.
Being born Aboriginal in this country is political. You cannot be Aboriginal and not be political. So I do feel it is a responsibility for myself and my family to continue to carry that fight that my nan was a part of back in 72 and has been a part of every day since.
To me, it's about the way we work together to address the inequalities, having the same opportunities, having choices, and being accepted for who they are, not for the colour of their skin or for their ethnicity, but because they happen to be a human being, a unique individual who has the potential to offer so much, not only to their family and community, but to our country, that for 65,000 years our people looked after.
The fire continues to burn there, and it still says something very powerful to the Australian public, and that is that Aboriginal Australia has been here for a very long time and will continue to be here into the future.
How's Michael? He's getting a big boy now?
Yeah.
Let's see, he's 5 months.
By the end of the year, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs was established, and it enacted a range of community initiatives, including a National Aboriginal Health Service. After 9 years of struggle, on August 16, 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam went to Dargaragu and poured a handful of Dargaragu soil into Vincent Lingiari's hand.
I solemnly hand to you these deeds as proof in Australian law that these lands belong to the Gurindji people.
Between 1972 and 1992, the embassy was established at a succession of sites across Canberra. It not only focused on land rights, but protesters also demanded action on funding for Aboriginal communities, self-determination and acknowledgement of sovereign Indigenous nations.
We achieved a lot of things from that Aboriginal embassy, and governments worked with us, particularly Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser when he became Prime Minister. And we were pursuing a great deal of development.
On the 20th anniversary of the original protest, the embassy was permanently re-established on its original site on the lawns outside Old Parliament House. Over the years, the Tent Embassy has become the focal point for a range of protests, including against Aboriginal deaths in custody, the Howard government's Northern Territory intervention in 2007, and cuts to essential Indigenous services. But the embassy remains controversial. Many have challenged its validity, and a number of arson attacks have damaged buildings within the camp. Recently, First Nation leaders, traditional owners and the embassy condemned protests outside Parliament House following a devastating fire which damaged the facade.
They've disrespected the local values, they've totally disregarded the history, the legacy and the hard fight that our old people have fought here on country.
Elders at the Aboriginal Tent Embassy were dismayed by alt-right and anti-vaccination protests near Old Parliament House.
They need to have a good, hard look at themselves. They are doing no favours to anyone in the way in which they're conducting themselves. I am very disappointed in seeing the coalescing of anti-vaxxers and a so-called sovereignty movement.
I think the problem that I've really watched over the last few weeks as we're watching it unfold has been the total abuse of the trauma of our people and our struggle. And watching that has really activated a lot of trauma within me.
Those protests are at odds with the aims of the Tent Embassy. The symbolism of the embassy has grown from its inception and has taken on different meanings, but it's always provoked and insisted on genuine, respectful engagement with First Nations jurisdictions, laws and governments.
I think the greatest achievement is that why is it there? I think that's everybody's asking. You know, that's what's on the lips of everybody. Why is the embassy still there? And so when they look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves that question, they have to look over their shoulder to see, okay, well, history hasn't been kind, and maybe we do need to change our discourse in order to improve the status here of Aboriginal people and give the proper recognition.
While the 50th anniversary will be acknowledged with a series of special events, the actual date, January 26th, remains a divisive day for many.
It breaks my heart that we have to do this every year.
I don't support changing the date. I support abolishing the date because at the core of it, what it will always represent is the genocide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We are still losing our children to the system at higher rates now than we were back in the stolen generations. The incarceration rates for our people, it's just, how far have we actually come? So to celebrate this country and what it represents and what it symbolises and that multicultural narrative when its very existence represents so much violence, so much trauma, and the genocide of our people.
I see it as a day in which we reflect and then we celebrate as a people. Because to me, I've always had this view that if you take the logic of Invasion Day being the 26th of January, then every day subsequent to the year in which the colony was established is an invasion day. So no day would be suitable if we take the logic of what I hear. What we should be doing is saying, why don't we acknowledge that we are still a strength? We were impacted by the history of the past, but we've got an opportunity of moving on. And sometimes I get frustrated. I just wished as much energy was put into debates around domestic violence, the safety of our women, reducing sexual abuse, and closing the gaps on all the targets as we put into one day. Because that's where change will come. We can't turn back the First Fleet. Australia has been developed from that point. Yes, there are many sad points in the connection of our history. But by gee, we've got a lot of good things to celebrate.
It is a very divisive date, increasingly in this country. I'm a realist, And I know that the date's not going to change soon, but we need to remember it was only in 1994 that the date was actually formalised. And there have been many dates for Australia Day over the course of the last 250 years. I don't think that date would be chosen if it was today, because it's divisive. It represents to First Nations people the coming of Governor Phillip and the English claiming Australia. So it is not a day that brings people together. The Australia Day theme is about reflecting on the truth of the story of Australia, of the amazing gift that First Nations people bring to this country, and that's the oldest continuous surviving culture on planet Earth. And the fact that we have been a nation, our nations that have survived, is something for everyone to celebrate.
Despite the date of the anniversary, it is a 50-year legacy of protest and support for the grassroots campaigns around the recognition of land rights, Aboriginal sovereignty, and addressing the very serious issues facing First Australians.
I want to have Aboriginal communities believe and know that we are committed to having their voices heard, and that they have a say in how government programs work at their community level. And I want to join states in that process. So when state and territory governments are working with communities, they're sitting down with them and planning it together, and then implementing the reforms and changes. That's where the change will come, and that's where we will close the gap at the community level.
Change is hard and change is slow, and change usually has to be fought for. And I think that the fact that we've got so many young Aboriginal people today who are asserting their identity, asserting their rights.
The biggest thing that's come out of it for me, and being the granddaughter of Matilda House, who was there in the 70s, is the strength and the power that us younger generations now hold, and how we move forward and how we show up in this colony. And I don't think that can be understated, the strength that our generations draw from that space that has been held by incredible black bodies for 50 years.
The youth, I just want to put it to the youth. They need to paint their picture now into the future, and we'll support and give them every support and guidance we can.
January 26 is a day that brings up strong feelings and serves as a reminder of the impact of European colonisation for First Nations Australians. But it also provides an opportunity to reflect on what is now our shared history. Now, we are intending to speak to two guests. We are having trouble connecting with Luke Pearson, who is the Chief Executive and Founder of Indigenous X. We will try and make contact with Luke Pearson. But now let's join Pat Anderson, who has a career spanning health, education and social justice over many decades. And among her many exceptional achievements is her work in the creation of the landmark collaborative document, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Auntie Pat, thank you so much for joining us on this program today. It is January the 26th, and of course we've been hearing a lot of reflections and thoughts on the significance of the day. I'd just like to begin, Auntie Pat, by asking you what the day means to you.
We made a family decision some time ago to actually stay at home on this day because it was too fraught to be out there. Come, once Christmas and the New Year's over, the sort of sense of dread descends upon me, because I think, oh God, the next thing is going to be the 26th of January, and here we go again. despite all the wonderful achievements, and I've been hearing the other speakers talk about, this is a wonderful country. You know, it's a country full of paradoxes and ambiguities, but it's very beautiful, and it's got a fascinating story, and that most Australians don't know it. But during the pandemic, what was exposed to everybody was the lack of leadership and lack of national political leadership and foresight. But, you know, for us, the lack of leadership has been around for a very long time. Successive governments of whatever political persuasion have failed to deal with the underlying tensions in this country, the relationship between us and all of those people who came after us. It still sits there, unresolved, undealt with. So even if the date was changed tomorrow, these big issues, are still going to be with us, as they have been for generation after generation after generation. Our country needs a respectful conversation to bring our shared histories and relationships out into the open. You know, on May 2017, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was offered to the Australian people as a gift, an invitation to have that conversation, a roadmap for creating a future where all our knowledges could be integrated into the life of the nation. This will unify the nation and begin to heal our country and create even a new narrative. So, you know, Australia, we must ask ourselves, I think, who are we today? What are our values? What do we stand for?
All right, well, those are very important questions, Auntie Pat, and thank you so much for that. I just wanted to let you know that we have had Luke Pearson also now be able to join us. So let's also ask Luke Pearson. Thank you for joining us, Luke. You're there on Awabakal country. And if you could just give us your sense, Luke, of what this day means for you. What are your thoughts and feelings on a day like this?
You know, for me, and I know Auntie Pat often says and likes to remind us that, you know, we truly do stand on the shoulders of giants in this country, of those who came before us. And so the meaning, you know, certainly as was asserted in 1938, the day of mourning, and more recently Invasion Day since, it's that reminder that Australia was founded as an invasion, that is unfinished business, that, you know, even regardless of all the treatment that has occurred since, which is a separate set of issues that Australia needs to come to terms with, it's never even reconciled its own invasion, its own origins, and found peace with that, and found a way to, you know, deal with Indigenous people on our own terms as the sovereign peoples of this land. So it's a day of protest, it's a day of remembrance, and it's a day to remind the rest of Australia that we are still here and we are not going anywhere.
Auntie Pat, for you, you've been reflecting on the work that you've done, particularly with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and calling that a roadmap for the way forward and for unifying Australia for all people who call this country home. Is that for you the unfinished business that we need to take up? Are there deeper issues that we also need to address at this moment?
You know, Patrick Dodson coined the phrase, of course, unfinished business, and it is time. In fact, it's long overdue. And sitting there on the table, because it was a gift, as I said earlier, to the Australian people. So the delegates at the regional dialogues decided that they would give this to ordinary Australians. They're confident that if you heard our voice, you would not turn away from us, and that you would, like you did in the 1967 referendum. So this gift, the Uluru Statement, is sitting on the table waiting for you, the Australian public, to grab hold of it. Our future and the future of this nation is in your hands, the Australian people. You have the power to call for constitution and correct all the wrongs of the past and finish once and for all this generation. Let's finish it this time. It's long overdue, as I say. You have the power to make that happen right now.
For you, Luke, is voice where we need to start with this process? Obviously, it's something that's been underway for generations, and there's been so much work already put in. Is the voice the key to unlocking how we go about this unfinished business?
As I've always said, for me, thinking about when this campaign first popped up and the journey it's been on to, get to the point that it's at, I am interested in the fine print when we get ready. So, the two main issues, like I want Indigenous representation, I want Indigenous self-determination, at the very least Indigenous control over the 18% of that 33 billion we always hear about that's actually targeted funding. So we need opportunities for Indigenous people to come together, as people did at Uluru, to make that statement and that gift, as Auntie Pat says. And then on the other side, we've got the people that we've got to negotiate and have got to meet us in the middle. And I have absolutely no faith in the current government or either side. I don't want to make this a left-right, Liberal-Labor conversation, because I have no faith in any government that's ever likely to come in Australia that I can imagine, that is going to meet us respectfully, that is going to have these conversations that we need to. So I'm, treaty, voice, whatever we want to call it, I see that really as the roadmap that Mob want to put forward. And then where we meet in the middle and the fine print of that, that's what I'm interested in. So, state treaties at the moment, Uluru conversation, still Mob pushing for sovereignty, still Mob pushing for national treaty. I don't want to, prevent anyone pursuing any area thereafter. All I would say is we really got to watch that fine print, because I have no trust at the moment.
So is that where we need to see this being driven at the top level? Pat, you pointed there earlier to political leadership and needing that to be giving greater direction with how we actually set the agenda and address these issues. In your view, given the amount of work that's already gone into what we're discussing here today, you've been at the front line of a lot of those conversations in formulating that document. So how do we get that goodwill that we're feeling more broadly in the community to resonate when it comes to the decisions that are made about our future?
Look, there is, as I've said earlier, and I do agree with Luke. There's been a lack of leadership in our decision makers for a long time. They just keep kicking the can down with us. That's why, and I pay tribute to all of those people who are at the dialogues around the country. We met at the convention. That's why they decided to gift the statement to the Australian people. So this has to be a people's movement, because governments are going to come and change, as we know that they do. But if the Australian people, if they support this, or then the people that they elect are forced to listen to the people. So this has to get any change here. The Australian people have to stand up and say this is what needs to happen. Let's at least have the darn conversation about who we are and what our values are, and who are we today in the 20th century, because we can't keep going on like this, constant fighting. We're all getting darn tired, and it's getting absurd, this tension between us all. It's got to be fixed in some way, and all the people that went to the Uluru and that fantastic process, it's unprecedented in this country, and I think it's an authentic piece of work that's sitting on the table, waiting for the Australian people to pick it up. So it's with you. You have the power.
For you, Luke, what are you feeling in this moment when it comes to the sorts of conversations that you have in the role that you have, the organisation that you've created? You're, meeting with people in all sorts of communities and all sorts of situations and experiences. What's the feeling that you're getting from them in terms of what the way forward is and what they're really wanting to see?
Look,
I think finding those areas of consistency. Like I said, when it comes down to really basic principles of self-governance, of Indigenous control, of leadership within the space from the government, trust and opportunity. No one's arguing against that. The right to be free from discrimination. There are so many things that there is universal consensus on. But at Indigenous X, I think a big part of what we do is try to also celebrate that diversity of voices, and that there are different people dealing with different issues in different communities, pushing for different ways forward. Like I said, self-control and Indigenous-led is always a key part of that, but less and less for me is the conversation about who wants to keep the date or change the date. It's who believes that the challenge that we face at the moment is built around a history that says Aboriginal can't be trusted to run our own affairs, can't be trusted to raise our own kids, don't deserve the right to self-determination. And that's actually the cause of Indigenous disadvantage, this idea that we're somehow so inferior. Or those people who recognise that contemporary Indigenous disadvantage exists because of that disempowerment, because of that initial removal and denial of sovereignty and every single thing that has happened since, and that the solution to that is Indigenous control and self-determination. So they're the conversations we're trying to have, and that everyone's having, not just mob like this. The country, I think, more and more people are ready for this.
Luke Pearson and Pat Anderson, this was never going to be long enough for the conversation that we are wanting to have today. I do appreciate you both joining us for the program. Thank you so much, and wishing you all the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you.
Let's return now to Ngambri Ngunnawal country in Canberra, where Creative Director Wesley Enoch has been coordinating a series of performance events overnight and throughout the day to mark January 26th, with artists from all over the country gathering around a symbolic campfire. Wesley Enoch, welcome to the show. With so much emotion felt on a day like this, what have you been wanting to bring to the fore with this program that you've worked on?
I think the big thing for me is really to say to Australia, we can sit down together and we can talk about our collective history. And just listening to Auntie Pat before, talk about our responsibility to tell this story and to grow together. This notion too that the truth-telling that needs to happen so that we can have a future together is so important. Here in Canberra, we had a ceremony last night, the 25th, where we had performers and dancers and singers. In fact, there's some singers and dancers behind me now who are going to be performing in a second. And also that this has been the 50th anniversary of the Tent Embassy. And I popped over there and had a sit-down with mob there. And there's been this sense in Canberra of something shifting, and how do we shift it together? And for me, I think it's the storytellers that play a really vital role in making sure that the stories are told, the truth can have a vehicle through which you can understand and connect, and that we are inviting all of Australia to sit down together.
You say you're inviting all of Australia to sit down together. Is that what you're seeing and feeling there?
Yeah, it's amazing actually. COVID has been, a bit of a dampener on everything, to be honest. But to see the number of people who come out with very open hearts to sit down and listen and engage in a cultural conversation is so, so amazing. Even listening to that song in the background now, you're kind of filled with this sense of pride that there's, several hundred people there sitting down now, listening to culture being kind of exercised for everyone.
And for you, I can't have a conversation with you on a day like this without asking you as well, Wesley, your thoughts and feelings. What are you reflecting on? Because, of course, we have so many different perspectives and experiences. What though, is foremost in your mind with the work that you do, but also just your personal feeling?
I think on a personal level, the day always makes me feel a little uncertain, because I think that it promotes one narrative of the country, because it has this anniversary of the arrival of the First Fleet. And it hasn't actually been something that we've unpacked as a nation. We haven't talked about it in more detail. And just remembering, as Auntie Pat said too, I think, it was actually Linda Burney early, just saying that, it's not that long since we actually legislated to do it on the 26th of January. Before then, before 1994, our National Day was whatever long weekend we could make at the end of January, and we lack the kind of rituals and ceremony around our healing and our telling of the truth. So for me, on a personal day, there's a sense of, as Auntie Pat was saying then, do you go out, do you engage, how do you engage? It's fraught for Indigenous Australians, and many non-Indigenous Australians are saying, well, if we can't do it as a country because of that date, let's change the date. Now, on a personal note, I go, well, if you change the date without changing the country, if we don't change the debate, if we don't actually engage as a nation around our true history, don't change the date in a flippant way just to get on with it. Actually engage in what the real problems are with that particular date, with our colonial history, with the stories that need to be told. It's not about ignoring the date. It's about kind of engaging in our colonial history and making sure that First Nations people have our history told and understood by the rest of the nation. On a very bigger kind of political note, I think culture is so important, and really if you see Yavin and you see the Survival Day concerts around the country, the 26th of January is a great celebration of our culture and our survival as well.
Wesley,
and I just love this idea that there's a song happening.
We are going to have to leave it there. Always so much to share when we speak with you. Wesley Enoch, Creative Director there on Ngambri Ngunnawal Country. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam.
And that brings us to the end of our special January 26 program. I'm Miriam Corowa. I would like to thank all the people involved in the broadcast and to all of you watching from wherever you are in this beautiful wide land we all call home. Thank you.